Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. This episode was prompted by someone who listened to episode 1 where I talked about how singles need a team, and one of those team members could include a therapist. The listener had never seen a therapist before and wanted to know how to find one. And now with the pandemic in full effect and all of the problems it's causing with regard to social isolation and the economy, it is a good time to answer this question. To do so, I spoke to Dr. Brian Martis, who's given this question a lot of thought. We cover all the basics, but we were a little rushed because both of us had appointments we had to get to. However, I suspect that I will return to this topic again. It is incredibly important, but not easy to navigate. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Dr. Brian Martis. Brian is a psychiatrist who works at the VA San Diego Healthcare System and UCSD Department of Psychiatry. He's been a psychiatrist for over 20 years, and his clinical and research interests are in the area of trauma, stress, and anxiety disorders. He's also committed to helping people find the help they want and need, both by reducing stigma as well as helping navigate the often confusing maze of the healthcare system. Because he's an overachiever, Brian is a student in my MBA course at the Rady School at the University of California, San Diego, and we're doing this interview just after class ended. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much, Pete.
So let me tell you a little quick story about how we got here, and then I'm gonna really turn things over to you. So 3 things happened to cause me to record this. So the first one is solo guest Darwin Metzger and I were talking about how we need to find a therapist. So he has some personal things and he wants to find a therapist who's a good fit for him. He lives in Los Angeles. I've recently moved to Los Angeles and I've had to sort of quote unquote give up my therapist back in Boulder, Colorado. My own personal belief is we can still do calls and so on, but it's just much better to be in person. And I have a very tall order because I have a fantastic therapist. And this is top of mind because in episode 1, I talked about the value of building a team as a solo and how a therapist can be an essential member of that team. The second thing is after that episode, I received an email from a young man who I never met before, who had stumbled onto the podcast and heard it. And he wrote to me, he said, "I'm 33, male, single, and sometimes just want to talk to someone. I'm considering finding a therapist, but I've never been to therapy and never sought out a therapist before. How do I find one?" And the third reason is that after our first class, our class is interrupted by a lunch, and we sat down and had a conversation, and you had brought up this topic of this sort of newish interview method. And then we started talking about how to choose a therapist, and you talked a little bit about your own experiences, and we both agreed that it's not easy and there aren't good resources. So Brian, no pressure. No pressure. But before that, I think there's probably some, we have to be careful a bit because you are a doctor, you're dispensing advice, but this is not medical advice. Right.
Well, so if I may, I wanted to say 2 things.
Okay.
One is that I'm sharing information so that people can use that information to make better decisions and achieve their goals.
Sure.
And the other is that I do work for 2 organizations that you mentioned, and I don't, right now my participation here is on my personal capacity.
I see.
In terms of the legalese, I have to say these are my personal opinions and not those of my employers.
Yes, as people say on Twitter, retweets are not endorsements by my, tweets are my own. And
yes.
So this is your own advice as an experienced person, but not from the VA or
yes.
not from UCSD. But we know you're legit because these places hire you. That's great. Okay. So I think we've set the stage. I can imagine I actually mentioned to a friend today that I was going to be taping this, and he said, "Oh, wow, that's really important." And I agree. And so I think whether you're solo or not, there's a lot of people who, in the same way they could use a physical therapist when they have physical pain, they can use, I wouldn't call them mental therapists, but, a therapist when they're having, whether it be emotional, psychological, or just any issues in their life. And so let's step back first and talk about different types of therapy.
Okay.
Right? So it seems to me that it would matter who you're choosing, depending on what they specialize in, what problems they focus on. So tell the world, what's the story?
Very quickly before I do that,
okay.
I wanted to say two things. One is I want to thank you for doing this. This is an extremely important topic.
By the way, Brian's already doing well in this course, so he's not.
No, but I'm serious. This is a very important topic, and it's sometimes the difference between life and death for some people.
I agree.
And I almost on a daily basis have family, friends, and colleagues call me about what do I do next.
I see.
And there are two issues that kind of stop them in their tracks. One is the stigma of, are people going to think I'm crazy? Is something wrong with me? And number two is even if a person doesn't think that way, they really don't know what to do next.
Yes.
This is a complete maze. And I feel very strongly about this and want to share information that it no longer is the case. And that's why I want to really thank you.
That's nice of you. I mean, I have to tell you, when I got that email from that guy, I was overwhelmed by it because, so I agree with you. There's so much stigma, and also for like young men, it's especially so.
Particularly, yes.
And yet this is a group of people who have major problems that they can get help from.
So I spent sleepless nights preparing for this podcast.
He's the most prepared person I've ever had. He has pages of notes in front of him.
And I was trying to find a simple way to say what is therapy. And then my colleague, Sonia Norman, she gave me this really nice thing that she got from the web.
Okay.
And so I'll also give credit for where I found it. But I like the explanation, which is when you seek therapy, you're doing one of these things. You're seeking clarity in some areas of your life. You're wanting to work through complex emotions. You're working through a traumatic experience. You are challenging negative thinking patterns. You're learning new techniques to cope with difficult situations. And you're focused on personal growth.
Oh, it's nice.
It could be one of these. It could be all of these. And this is really important because whenever I ask somebody to, consider a therapist, the first thing they tell me often is, well, but I'm not crazy. And this is a good paradigm, a reframe for this is what it is, right?
Yes.
The other thing that another really great colleague of mine, Abigail Anka, told me is one way to present this is what are your functional goals, right? What are your life goals and what are your functional goals? And what if you could get professional help to achieve your functional goals, right? That would make sense, right? We do that for financial advice.
Save money.
Exactly.
I had Money Amy on, in one of the previous episodes,
exactly.
how to get financial freedom.
Exactly.
Yes.
And you want to run the marathon, you get a personal trainer.
That's right.
So it's really important to pause and think, why then do we stop when somebody says, get a therapist?
Yes.
Right? And so this is, the reasons for this go beyond this podcast, but it's something I want to challenge people with, these examples.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Why stop short? Right. If we're willing to, we hire someone
for everything else.
We hire someone to help us lose weight. We hire someone to help us. So, I will put those statements that you made in the exhibits and the transcript of my website.
Okay. And I'll cite that. So
that's great.
Because it comes from a project called the Depression Project.
So before you get into the different types of therapy, I think this is really neat because this gentleman who emailed me, one of the things that he said was that he was surprised that I sometimes go and see my therapist when things are going well. And I think the reason is he thinks about therapy as just helping you cope with complex emotions or helping with trauma. But going to a therapist for personal growth can happen whether you're struggling or not. And you might even be in a better position to grow when you're not struggling.
Absolutely.
So that's great.
Well, absolutely. And I thank you for bringing that up because we always think of therapy as, when you say I'm going to therapy, the first thing somebody will say is everything okay?
Yeah, that's right.
Like, are you all right? And, do you need any help? And we need to really stand that archaic paradigm on its head, because that's just not like, would you run a marathon if you didn't train for several years? You wouldn't, right?
Yes.
So why would it be wouldn't it be the same for your mental, health?
Yes.
And arguably it's far more important than your physical health, because it's intimately connected to it.
Indeed. I've been working through sort of principles for solo and living a remarkable life. And one of them is this idea that you're never going to be finished, right? You're never going to be like, okay, I'm done. Life is just, I'm just done.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're constantly going to be working on new things, trying new things. We're never going to be the moment you feel complete will be a moment where you go, oh, there's more to do.
Absolutely.
And so this idea of growth, I think, is
absolutely. There's no such thing as you're done. And just yesterday, I learned in my operations class about Kaizen, which is, the Japanese Toyota model of continuous,
improvement,
growth and improvement.
Yes, that's right.
So,
okay. So I'm sure our listeners and I will recognize some of these types of therapies and therapists and orientations, but can you give us like a quick primer on that?
Yeah. I'm going to, I've categorized therapy and therapists in my own way. So, don't look for a textbook that says this.
Look, that's why you're on here. If you could just read it on the internet, we wouldn't need you.
Exactly. And the reason I've categorized it this way, I mean, part of it is true. If you look at some categorizations, that would make sense. But part of it is just a functional way to understand these things. So there's three ways I want to make you think about this. So one is, therapy when you are not in distress or in distress, right? So if you're not, and you mentioned the growth part. Mm-hmm. So that would be a not in distress kind of, like you feel some dissonance, you feel some aspiration, and you want to be in a therapy, which is either an insight oriented therapy or kind of a performance enhancing, and it kind of borders on coaching.
Yeah. I wanted to ask that. Like, correct. I feel like life coaching has kind of grown in prominence. It feels less stigmatized.
Correct.
And it feels a little more focused on achievement.
Correct. And technically we don't necessarily call that therapy in my field. That somewhat, falls into counseling, coaching, that realm.
Yes.
Then there's when you are in distress and that's, if it's acute, then we call it, crisis intervention. But if it's serious enough that you are so distressed or is disrupting your functioning, and those are the two key things. One is you're so distressed that it's impairing the quality of life, and the other is that is interfering with your functioning.
Okay.
Whether it's personal functioning, relationship functioning, or work functioning.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
That's the threshold for us to call it a clinical condition, and you might have heard the term a clinical disorder.
Okay.
So that kind of therapy.
Okay.
So the first kind, you'd go to a counselor or you would go to a coach, right?
Yes.
Or you would even go to somebody who's not a counselor or coach. And one example of that is pastoral counseling.
I see. Yes.
So
a mentor of some sort.
Or a mentor.
Okay.
So that's the first group. The second group, you would go to a therapist. And
so you're distressed in this case.
Yes. And so you would go to, say, a licensed marital and family therapist, or you'd go to a social worker, or you'd go to a psychologist, or sometimes you would even go to a psychiatrist.
So what I sort of sense with this a little bit is, but the second group, they can help you if you're not distressed, right? They may.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So but they can serve both purposes.
Yes.
I
yes.
see.
But mostly people don't, because it's our archaic medical model, which is, it's only when something's wrong. For the most part, when something's wrong is when you go to the clinic or the doctor,
yes,
right?
I see.
With one exception, which is your annual physical, which you reluctantly go to.
Yeah, that's right. That's really interesting. So my therapist, I pay out of pocket. Mm-hmm. And so he'll see me for anything because there's no insurance that steps in and goes.
And that's
he's too healthy right now.
Yes. Well, and Pete, that's the part 2 of our podcast, because that's a whole new issue. And it's a very important issue, which means if you want to do therapy, well, who's going to pay for it, right?
Yes.
And that's a whole new discussion.
It's a great luxury I recognize that I have when I was a younger man.
Yeah.
I had to go to the school counseling center because that's all I could afford.
And we can talk about that later if we have time. Okay.
Sure.
But, broadly, we think of three kinds of therapy, three broad kind of bins, if you will. One is like an insight-oriented or psychodynamic therapy. So this is a modern version of the psychoanalytical therapy as people know it.
Like
so
the person laying on the couch.
Yes.
But not laying on
except
the couch.
that we're not laying on the couch.
Right.
And the basis for that is really to develop a relationship between the patient and the therapist where they examined that relationship in the context of their past relationships.
Okay.
And that's how they worked through some of the difficulties they're having currently.
Okay.
And that's why, I'm sure you've heard enough of the jokes about your childhood and your mom and things like that. So that came from the psychoanalytical field, but there are some distilled versions of that, which is really relationships and how you carry them with you and how you explore them. So that's called kind of insight-oriented therapy or psychodynamic psychotherapy.
So that's number one.
Yeah. The second bin, which is probably most people have heard and know by now, is called cognitive behavioral therapy.
Indeed. Even I know that one.
Yeah. So basically, cognitive behavioral therapy involves talking about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors without going into, your relationship with your mom or your relationship with your dad, or it still talks about your experience in the form of, say, schema that you look at the world, but those kinds of relationships are less explored. What you're exploring is really your current thinking, behavior, your thinking, your feelings, and your behaviors, and how they're related.
I see. Yes. No, I was, when I was a PhD student, I was in a research psychology program, but, first year you share all your classes with the clinical and counseling psych students, as well as the, industrial organizational students, the cognitive students, et cetera. And I remember I had a buddy who, pretty early on, he was starting to as part of his internships, see people and so on. And he was practicing CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I just got a chuckle out of it. He would kind of experiment with these sort of outrageous things. Like, so let's suppose someone, had a lot of like they were sort of easily embarrassed. And they felt like people were very judging them. And he would give them tasks in which they would put themselves in what would be an embarrassing situation. And then he would have them closely monitor how they would be treated. So he'd have them stain their shirt. Or my favorite was go into a bathroom and sit in the stall and make loud grunting sounds. And then come out. And, and the idea was no one made fun of him and laughed at him and pointed at him and all that kind of stuff.
I'm really glad you brought that up because that's the classic exposure-based cognitive behavioral therapy that we give for social anxiety disorder,
yes,
right?
That's right. Yes.
And so what you described to me is a social anxiety situation where people have a fear of scrutiny.
Yes.
And not everybody who does have that transiently has a disorder. Like, for example, most of us have all the symptoms when we are asked to stand up in front of the class unannounced and to give a speech,
Indeed.
right? So, in fact, there's a test called a Trier social stress test, which people walk into a room, they're given a topic, and there are 5 people sitting in white coats, and they do not give you any cue whatsoever if you're saying something
stone-faced.
Yeah, and that's fun. That is known to be one of the most stressful conditions for human beings. It spikes your cholesterol. Your cortisol.
Yes.
And it's a really important point, which means that for us human beings, uncertainty and social stress are the most stressful things.
Yes.
And so the treatment is actually, first of all, analyzing the behaviors, making a hierarchy. So you'll pick the lowest, the thing that makes you the least anxious first.
Okay.
And then you will master it in the first session. It's not necessarily the first session, but you'll first make a list of these behaviors, right? Then you'll prioritize them. And then you will rank them by how distressed you're. And we call that subjective units of distress. So 0. So
it's a very...
What would be your 0 versus what would be 100, right? So sitting in the bathroom would potentially be 100 or standing up and giving a speech. And a 0 would be just being by yourself doing nothing or at home, right? And then there's everything in between. So you pick those things, and in each session, you expose the person to it.
I see.
And there's a brain science basis for this. And then there's just a common sense science, right? Which is, as you expose yourself to this in a graded way, in a safe situation, you get habituated to it, and desensitized to it.
And so my understanding is cognitive behavioral therapy works.
Absolutely.
It really works.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What's the third?
The third is what's known as the third wave of therapies, which is mindfulness-based therapies and mindfulness-based stress reduction. Many people have heard various versions of this. Some of it is just out in the public in terms of just mindfulness behaviors. But there's actually therapies that are built around mindfulness. Yeah, so-called MBCT, so mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And these therapies incorporate the mindfulness component into the cognitive behavioral session.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, I had this experience many years ago where I started to meditate, and I was doing a particular form of meditation called loving kindness meditation. And what was striking about it was, first of all, it's not easy to do, right? You know, to practice this in the same way that yoga is not easy to do. It becomes easier as you do more of it. But it really worked. And it had this incredible sort of pervasive effect in my world where I became like a less angry driver, for example. And, but I never thought that I could get that as part of a traditional therapy.
Yeah. And, it's growing, because people have realized that, our existing kind of armamentarium, if you will, is kind of woefully inadequate for the wide ranges of, experiences that we have, and the wide variation of, kind of preferences that we have. But mindfulness, one of the things that I like about it is that it kind of, first of all, it draws from kind of Eastern philosophies, and an important component of it is acceptance.
Yes, that's right.
And then there's a version of that in CBT called acceptance and commitment therapy, ACE or ACT therapy.
Okay, so this all sounds a bit complicated to me. Obviously promising, given that many of these work, especially. So how do you go about finding a therapist?
So that's the $1 million question, which brought us here together. So 1 minute before I answer that question, I'll share with you, what I call, how do you find resources, right? So usually we can get to when do you think you want therapy, but let's for now assume that you already want to explore.
I think that's let's condition this on, this is for people who say, I think my life would be better.
Yeah. So, the first thing is you could look on the, what I call the interweb. Yes. And as you know, there's so much out there and it's so confusing.
And what do you search for and so on?
Correct.
Right?
So I would search for, I give you three things, right?
Please.
One is, look at some academic sites. So if you're in say San Diego, look up the UC San Diego site. Look at the academic sites and look at this, Department of Psychiatry or Department of Psychology and look for, resources.
Okay. Good. Cause these are vetted by experts.
Correct. But these will usually be in the clinical realm.
Got it.
Okay. So, the other is professional organizations. So American Psychological Association, American, Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy Association.
And I'll put these in the exhibits.
Yeah. And there's one particular, website which my colleague recommended to me, which is called Psychology Today.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So,
I used to blog for Psychology.
There you go. So you'd probably be able to speak about it better than I do. But it gives information. Allows you to search for different kinds of, therapists, closer to your area, your zip code. Mm-hmm. These are all, I don't necessarily know how they're vetted and they're on that website. However, it gives you a place to start.
Okay.
And it gives you at least some names, and sometimes those names may be part of your insurance, list.
Yes, I see.
So, and, we were talking about how do you pay for these things. So, And the last group is what I call patient advocacy groups. So for clinical conditions, there are some very strong and, let me just say, outstanding patient advocacy groups like NAMI and ADA, which is the American, the Anxiety Disorder Association of America.
And what was the first one?
NAMI is the National Alliance of Mentally Ill.
I see.
And it's one of the older organizations. And there's the ADA. And then there's the IOCDF. This is for people with obsessive compulsive disorder.
We're going to put all these on my website. It'll be at the bottom of the transcript for people.
So let's get to how do you find the therapist, right?
Okay.
So let's say you know what you want, and let's say you know which of the bins we talked about, right? The insight, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, or the kind of mindfulness thing.
Yeah. So my quick observation about that is like, I know sort of what I like. I mean, I've already been to therapy, so I know this, but like, I don't like the sort of psychodynamic stuff that much. Like, I don't want to sit and revisit my childhood a whole bunch of times. Like, I want to work through practical kinds of, as you said, feeling, thought, behavioral changes in my life that can make myself better. So I have a sense of that, but for some people, they may have to sort of try this out and see was one work or fit. No,
that is true for even if you knew what you wanted. So because you would still have to try out whether the person that you're going to visit right. So there's a tryout.
There's a fit in terms of orientation, and then there's a fit in terms of personality.
Yes,
or approach.
All of the above, right? So there would be this. Even if you knew what you wanted, there would be an exploratory period.
Okay.
And if you don't know what you want, then it takes a little longer. The way to maybe fast track that is ask family, ask friends, ask your primary care doctor, ask employee assistants, those kinds of things. I'm not saying you need to do what they say. I'm just saying asking these people gives you some options.
I see. Yes.
Right? So
it's like old school word of mouth.
Yes. Always.
The same way you're looking for a mechanic.
Yes.
You ask your friends.
Yes. And this is just, for a place to start.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's the only thing you need to do. You can cross-check that with the academic sites or the professional organizations. The other way is to actually, just pick 3 and go visit them and talk. It's not the most fun thing to do. It's work. But when you do that once or twice and you get a sense of like who this person is, what their approach is, and what they have in store for you, it gives you a sense of, oh, okay, I like the first person, better. It's so feel empowered to explore, to shop, to ask questions.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I'll tell you, I want to ask you about this. So I have this particular bias, which is I'd like an older therapist. And it's, I recognize that maybe a younger therapist has better training or more up-to-date training or so on. But I like someone who has, I like to use the word patine. They've had some experience in life. They've seen lots of different people. And because I'm getting a little older, I sort of like that. I don't have a preference about gender. I've had great male and great female therapists. And my problems require something like that, But is there some sense, does that matter? Do the demographics, so to speak, of the therapist matter, or should they?
This is a fantastic question because I have arguments with my dad quite often about about the doctors that I have recommended for him.
All right.
I'm going to give you a very simple. So let me say broadly, all of that is fine, which means it's if you feel more comfortable with a woman or a man or a younger or an older or somebody in the universe. Those are fine things.
Okay.
But ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So you have to sit there and ascertain for yourself a few things. And we'll talk about those few things. So those preferences are fine.
Okay.
It's important to not conflate, feeling good with the competence of the therapist.
That's good because a good therapist is going to actually at times make you feel uncomfortable.
Correct. And this is the constant, or this is a chronic issue that I deal with where people come to me and say, well, I don't feel, and I say, when I actually sit them down and go through, well, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? I often realize it's not because it's actually because the therapist is very competent.
Okay.
but therapy is hard work.
It's like if you went to a physical therapist and it was just a pleasurable, easy massage, right?
Exactly.
Versus the kind of pain that goes with rehabilitation.
Exactly. So, but really, you still need to ask the therapist, in the first session, you want to know a little bit about them.
Okay.
You want to know what approach they have towards,
so we're transitioning from you've identified people.
Yes.
Set up an appointment.
Yes.
You go into their office and it sounds like you're saying you should take a little bit of control.
Well, I'm saying that you should feel empowered.
Okay.
To ask questions.
That's great.
Because it's your life.
And yes, right.
And if you feel any kind of hesitation, think about the other situations in your life.
If you don't trust your mechanic.
Exactly. Would you not ask him questions when he says your bill is $1,000?
Yes.
Or would you not ask your financial advisor, why is he recommending this versus that?
Yes.
This is no different. I would say it's more important.
Okay.
Now, a word of caution. So when you go on, some of these websites, the APA website or other website, they have these series of questions. And I've always wondered about that because I would be very uncomfortable saying, where did you go to school and what grade did you get in school?
Yes.
And, et cetera, et cetera. So those are just guidelines. I think you can ask the same questions in a much more, inquisitive and kinder and productive way.
Not like an interview is what
Correct.
you're saying.
So for example, you could say, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and approach to patients?
That's right.
Right? Or, hey, I told you what I've been struggling with. Do you have a lot of, do you have a lot of other people like me?
I see.
Even the words matter, right?
Yes, that's right.
If I say what experience you have, you're going to be defensive. I mean, I'm just saying.
Yeah, I get it.
But if I say, are lots of people like me that you worked with?
Yeah.
And you'd say, and that would give you, the same answer.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Or a better answer.
Probably a better answer.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. What else do you have?
Oh, the other is what is the framework for the therapy?
I see.
What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next?
Oh my God, this is so fascinating. I've never done this before.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because I want to know, am I meeting with you every day? Am I meeting you every week?
Yes.
How long am I meeting? What are we going to do in each session?
Mm-hmm.
And that will very quickly give you a sense of, is this person really doing what they said they were doing on their website? Because, we often see people saying that they do certain things, but that's not exactly what they do.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying if you're looking for a certain thing, right, you want to get that approach.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I had, in a previous episode, I spoke to my barber. I feel like this is a little bit like the same process. Mm-hmm. You go to the barber, you have kind of an open mind, but you sort of pay attention to how, he or she approaches the way they cut your hair.
Absolutely.
Do they listen to you? How do you feel in the chair?
Absolutely.
Do they push you a little bit to try some new things? And
Absolutely.
so on. And, and then you might not return. You might find someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're kind of looking to build a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, I always think about, which is unfortunate because that we have modeled our medical system that way. But, you always think of, I'm going to my doctor.
Yes.
And then you think about going to, say, your psychiatrist as not your doctor.
Yes.
You think of it as something not medical.
Right.
And that's a dichotomy that's kind of artificially created. And sometimes it hurts us to think that way, and primarily through stigma.
Yes.
But the other is not understanding that your brain and your brain is part of your body.
Indeed.
And they're intimately related, more intimately than what most people know.
Yeah. So let me ask a question. So in terms of navigating this, you're getting to know this person. I assume you should just be upfront. You just say, I'm going to be meeting with a few people,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's okay for them to know this,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just so they know what the expectations are,
Mm-hmm.
and then. So you go, you're assessing
Mm-hmm.
the fit, your feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, knowing that it shouldn't just be about feeling good.
Mm-hmm.
And suppose you decide to go with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Do you tell them? You just
It depends on the context. You know, it depends on the context. If you've already told them up front and
that you're going to be visiting 3 or 4
correct,
people.
and maybe you don't show up again,
they'll know.
They'll probably know.
It's not like a first date. You don't have to tell the person you're not asking them out again.
It all depends on your values, right? So I would agree with that. The only and there's a value in that because it's you feel good about yourself, right? That you've been upfront, you've done your thing. But it's not absolutely necessary because they have enough people to like.
I just didn't know.
Yeah. In other words, you don't have to worry about them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I get it. They're professionals.
Yes.
Okay, so you've done this.
Mm-hmm.
Then what?
So let's say you started and you told your story and they listened to your story and they said, you know, I want to meet with you several times to understand the situation better.
Yes.
At the end of those, say 3 times, I'm going to give you a sense of what I think, my professional opinion, and what we can do.
Okay.
So
a plan. They give
correct.
You a plan.
So we want a treatment. We want a diagnosis, if you will.
Yes.
Okay. And as we know, there's not always a diagnosis when you're not looking for a diagnosis. If you're looking just personal growth, but for diagnosis, you can substitute the person's impression, right? And that's number 1. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is what is the plan of action or a treatment plan?
So it should be articulated.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely. Yeah. And because many times people come to me and they'll say, well, I've been doing this therapy and I'll say, walk me through that. And almost 6 months to 1 year later, they say, well, but I don't know what my diagnosis is.
Oh, that's a problem. I see.
Right. And I'm like, well, what are you doing in your session? Right. So, and not that labels are important, but, it tells me what the communication has been.
I see.
So you want to feel heard, but you want the person to tell you what they think and what the plan is.
Okay.
Again, let's go, going back to your car. If you took it to the mechanic and he said, he listened to you and he listened to the car and he mumbled some things, which they normally do, and he gave you $500 bill.
And then said, come back in a week.
And did the same thing. And you'd be like, I need to know what's going on with my car, right? So, and the third thing is, a good therapist would, welcome questions.
I see.
Right? And when you ask questions, that they would welcome them and give you a reasonable response.
I see. Okay.
And not get irritated or flustered or, like, why are you asking these questions, right? So you want to feel that they are partnering with you.
Yes.
This is not a friendship. But this is a partnership.
Yeah, I see.
And you should feel partnered with.
Okay. So suppose you don't, and you decide after 3 or 10 or 20 sessions that you want to move on.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that now you have more information about what you're looking for in the next therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything special about that, terminating that relationship?
Well, so again, we go back to, do you want to bring that up and discuss that, or do you want to just not show up,
right?
Or do you want to say that through email or?
It's personal style.
It's personal style. It's always good to be able to sit there and say, I think I've gained a lot from these sessions.
Yes.
I want to look for something different. It makes people feel their own sense of agency and it empowers them.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't beat anybody, senseless in terms of, you didn't do that. Not at all. It's, ultimately you want to take care of yourself and it's okay. So
that's great. And you have like, a couple sort of parting thoughts.
Yeah. So, just before the parting thoughts,
Sure.
can I just quickly say that it's really important that when you're doing your therapy, so how do you know it's working? You should be talking about your goals.
Okay.
You should be working towards your goals.
Yes.
There should be some outcome measures. So there's some way to measure that you're moving towards your goals.
This is really important because I think that a lot of people, especially people who've never been to therapy before, they think of the old school sitting on the couch
Correct.
where you just talk, and the person writes down notes.
Correct.
And what you're describing is a much more collaborative,
an active, collaborative.
This is what
partnership.
I see. This is what I think we should do.
Yeah.
How's it going? let's reassess,
Yes.
and so
Yes.
on.
And that's, what I'm saying right now is very much along the realms of, or the lines of the CBT approach.
Yes, right.
The other two, can also be, active like this, but in a slightly different way.
Okay.
But I just wanted to make sure that people know that if you feel that you are working towards your goals, and you're able to measure those goals, then you know something is going right.
Yeah, that's right. In the same way that your car is working again,
Correct.
the same way that
Correct.
your knee's not clicking anymore,
Correct.
and so
But
on.
don't just feel like things are great because once a week I get to go there. I feel really good
Yes.
because they listen to me. I feel I have a place to
Are
vent.
my relationships improving? Am I less
Exactly.
anxious?
Exactly.
Am I
Exactly. So those are the
sleeping better?
those are the
etc.?
metrics. Okay.
But one thing I think is important to note is that these changes may not happen overnight.
Oh,
They may
thank you
take-
so much for bringing
They
that
may
up.
take weeks, months. It may take some time.
Absolutely. So remember how long it took you to get where you are.
Yes.
And then know that it's kind of unrealistic to then expect things to, if it took you years to get where you are, that's it's kind of unrealistic for
Fix
you
it in 3 sessions.
in 3 sessions, right?
Yeah.
That being said, is, I'm not advocating, necessarily advocating like years of therapy,
Yes.
For everybody. I think it's important to be patient. It's important. I always use the marathon analogy for this. Is think about it as a marathon. You're running 1 mile, you're running 2 miles, you're running 3 miles. And one day you will run 26 miles
right.
with pain. And then
Yes.
one day you'll run 26 miles without pain.
Yes,
so,
that's great.
so remember that. Number 2 is people always think that therapy should make them feel good. And initially, you're not necessarily going to feel good. It's going to be, a little bit more of more turmoil because you are now facing things that you may not have faced.
Yeah.
And it's, again, the marathon analogy, your body hurts, you can't get out of bed, that kind of stuff, right? But eventually when you stick with it, then you will see the benefits of that, right? Because you're strengthening yourself.
That's great. So, I know that it is now Saturday night, and you've been in class for 2 straight days. But you have some parting pearls of wisdom.
Yeah. So just 3 things,
Okay.
and they're just random things. So, but I felt it was really important to share with our listeners. So one is one of hope, which is therapy works. Good therapy is life-saving and life-changing. That's number 1. Number 2 is, you are amazing and you should feel empowered to take your life in your hands and ask people questions. And,
I'm like smiling ear to ear right now hearing this.
do not compromise. And I'm talking to our, listeners
Yes.
as well as you, Pete.
No, I know you were talking to listeners,
but
these are people who are pursuing a remarkable life.
absolutely.
And so-
You're amazing. You deserve the best. You should feel empowered to ask the questions and receive the answers that you seek.
That's
Number 2.
fabulous.
And number 3 is, this is particularly for people who, may be thinking, hey, should I do therapy? Should I not? Think about it as an investment. Think about it as what functional goals I want to achieve,
Yes.
and then then approach it from that point of view. Unfortunately, the reason I'm saying that is because of the whole stigma of, should I get therapy or not?
Look, it's why I talk about it.
Yeah.
It's why I talk about it to my friends. It's why I've been willing to talk about it with strangers.
And I absolutely love that.
Because I just think that, if you can, I'm living a good life. I'm proud of the life that I've built. It's been a lot of hard work and so on. I feel like doing that thing, seeing therapists, and as I said, some have been completely life-changing and some have been so-so. But, on balance, it has been completely worth the time, the effort, the money, and you're right, the discomfort in order to pursue that. I think I agree with you. You have to feel like you're worth it in order to do that. And I think a little healthy dose of patience. Brian, or Dr. Martis, I should
Brian
say.
is good.
I had no doubt that this was going to be useful. I feel like this could be will be a great resource for people. And I'm going to make sure that you and I collaborate to get all of these things in the exhibits that people can find on my website.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. And thank you again. I don't think you understand how important this is. Not that you don't understand how important this is, but I don't think that you understand the impact you are going to make with sharing information like this with people, because like I said, it's life-saving.
And there's just not a good place to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I hope for the listeners, I'd like to hear from you. Has this been helpful? And I have a feeling I might be revisiting this at different times throughout the podcast.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Brian. You're a gem. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com.